Okay, so I haven't decided yet what I'm going to title this video, but there's a good chance I'm just going to call it Mistborn Secret History because that's the main thing I'm going to be talking about here. I did read the other two Mistborn short stories in Arcanum Unbounded, which was the 11th Metal and Allomancer Jack and the Pits of Eltania. I don't really have much to say about them. The 11th Metal is boring and short and uninteresting. It's very much basically everything, but it's also inoffensive. Like everything I said about the hope of Elantris in the previous Arcanum video, just copy that here. The same thoughts apply. Allomancer Jack was a delight to read. I absolutely loved it. It was hysterically funny to me. I loved the commentary from Handerwim, I believe is the name of his terrace steward who writes the stories and edits them. I love getting to learn more about the Koloss and how they propagate and still exist in Era 2, because that was something I was wondering about. I also loved learning what the hell is meant by Koloss blooded. The implications are less horrible than I had assumed. Uh, the first time the phrase Koloss blooded was introduced. So let's just leave it at that. I did like learning that Koloss are essentially like equal numbers of men and women, really. They just all look the same. So, like, no one can tell that some of them are women because they all look like they all read as masculine to humans. I like I said, I just loved it, but it's not exactly a deep story. It's more of a comedy story, so I enjoyed it. Anyway, let's talk about the real star of the show here in terms of the Scadrial stories in Arcanum Unbounded, which is Mistborn's Secret History. I have a lot of thoughts on this one. A lot. Most of them have to do with like wider Cosmere connection stuff, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later. First, I want to talk about this story and its relationship to the past, present, and future of Mistborn as a series. So, Kelsier. Kelsier, it is now becoming apparent, especially after reading Sanderson's postscript, Kelsier is going to be, I guess, arguably the main character of Mistborn as a whole. Like, each era will probably have... my feeling right now is that each era will have its own protagonists, but that Kelsier will be like the thread that connects them all, and his arc will probably be something we follow through all, I believe, 4 eras that are planned. Which I like. Kelsier was one of my favorite characters. I really enjoyed him in the first book, and I'm really, really happy to have him back. I personally like people. There are lots of people who really don't like the resurrection trope. I love it. Like I complained in Words of Radiance about fake out deaths, but fake out deaths and resurrections are two completely different things. Resurrection is one of my favorite fantasy tropes when done right, and what I mean by when done right is when it's appropriately complicated in terms of like the emotions involved. Like when it's not just a yay, this person is back, when there's like a dark twist to it. I wish I could give the example that I'm thinking of like the best resurrection I've ever read in a fantasy story, but obviously that would be a massive spoiler for a book that I'm not talking about right now, so I'm not going to do that. So I love that Kelsier's back. I don't mind that at all. I don't think the fact that he's still alive cheapens his original sacrifice in any way. I do, however, think that some other things do end up being cheapened by this story. I take issue with a couple of things that Kelsier does in the final part of this story. So once we are in the part of the story that is essentially Kelsier observing the events of Hero of Ages, I have a lot of problems with some of the stuff that happens there. So here are the things I have an issue with. Number one, Preservation's death. I think that Preservation's death is maybe the best moment in all of the Cosmere. Like, out of everything that Sanderson has written that I've read so far, I think the moment that stuck with me the most, that I think about the most, that is the most unique and interesting and compelling moment, was the death of Preservation in Hero of Ages. And the reason it was so compelling is because he died alone, he died unknown, he died unmourned. He died and literally no one even noticed because no one even knew he was alive to begin with. And that was that. And literally no character even knows that happened. We, the readers, are just told by Sazed's omniscient narration that a god just died. And we have to be told through omniscient narration because otherwise it would be impossible for us to know because no characters are aware of it. And I love that. It's such a huge moment, the death of a god, and it's treated as such a low-key, quiet thing that just sort of happens in the background and no one even notices. And I love that so much. And I do think that Secret History kind of cheapens that. It cheapens it, I think, by having Preservation speak to Kelsier as he's dying, having Preservation essentially have someone there as he's dying, even though Kelsier isn't literally present where Preservation is dying, but like, he has someone to talk to, he's giving his powers to Kelsier, stuff like that. It's not the sad, lonely death of a god who no one even knows exists. And I feel like this could have been fixed so easily. Like, literally nothing about this story had to change. The only thing I would change is that after Kelsier returns from his trip to the Ire, after he returns to the mainland, to the Final Empire, he should no longer be able to communicate with Preservation at all. Like, why just make it so that while he's off dealing with the Ire, Preservation's mind deteriorates to the point where he's no longer able to communicate at all. Like, he's still alive when Kelsier gets back, but he's just like a presence that Kelsier can sometimes feel, and nothing more. So Kelsier tries to talk to him and he fails. He cannot get a response out of Preservation. And then he gets distracted by something. Kelsier does. Like, maybe the scene where I actually like this scene a lot, where he tries to influence one of the soldiers in Ellen's army to talk to Vin for him. And instead, he accidentally starts what was essentially the religious schism that happens in Hero of Ages, where the various survivorists turn on each other based on their idea of who has Kelsier's favor. And Kelsier is obviously horrified seeing that, and then Ruin shows up and is like, haha, even when you try to fight me, you end up serving me. And Kelsier is like, oh my god, he's right. And is horrified by that. That scene was great. So have that happen, and then have Kelsier, like, stop paying attention to the plot for a while because he's, like, reeling from the realization that everything he does just serves Ruin and that he can't do anything. And then suddenly, he should just have this moment where he's like, wait, I no longer feel Preservation at all. And then he realizes that Preservation died and he didn't even notice because he was too busy having his own personal crisis. I think that would have been fantastic. It would have, not only would it have not cheapened that original scene, I think it would have improved it because it would have added, like, an additional layer to just how much no one noticed Preservation's death. So I feel like that would have been an easy fix that would have had no negative consequences really for the story, and would have preserved one of my favorite moments from the original trilogy. So really, going forward, I'm basically going to pretend like that's what happened, like it's my headcanon that that's what happened, because, again, it doesn't change anything. Like, everything else can stay the same. The other thing where I feel like something from the original trilogy was slightly cheapened is the idea that Spook needed Kelsier's help to A, break free from Ruin's control, and B, figure out that he needs to send the message to Vin about the spikes. I feel like both of these things worked better as moments of heroism and brilliance from Spook himself, without any help from Kelsier. Um, and and I feel like you could have had this story again. I'm writing fan fiction here apparently today, but I feel like after Preservation dies and Kelsier gets his powers, Kelsier should have been too afraid to use them because he's just had the experience with the soldiers, and so he has this fear that whatever he does is going to serve Ruin. So instead of using Preservation's power to do anything, he just watches and expects the worst to happen. And then he witnesses, rather than, he does not influence, but he witnesses Spook break free from Ruin's control, and that inspires him because he essentially thinks, oh, if someone who was literally being mind controlled by Ruin can act against Ruin, then surely so can I. I just need to figure out how. And then that would motivate him to strike at Ruin in the final moment and give Marsh the opening he needs to rip out Vin's earring. So yeah, I've just told you my fan fiction version of Secret History because those two moments really annoyed me. They're not a big deal. Like I said, they're so irrelevant that you can easily just change them to what I just suggested and nothing else would have to change. But they annoy me because it feels like they cheapen something from the original trilogy, and I feel like that's something you want to be really careful to avoid doing when you're writing a story like this, which is like recontextualizing the events of a previous story, especially when it's a story as beloved and emotionally resonant as Mistborn Era 1, I feel like maybe a more careful hand should have been applied to writing this story when it comes to dealing with scenes from the original trilogy, so that you don't change their meaning too much. Okay, that's enough of me complaining, though. Overall, this story was fantastic. I was expecting this story to explain a lot about Kelsier, because of course, the postscript of the Bands of Mourning did say that this story is the one that explains why Kelsier is still alive. I was not expecting this story to be like the actual explosion or implosion, I guess, of the entire Cosmere that it was. This is the first true Cosmere story. That's weird, right? Like, the first actual full-on Cosmere crossover story where all these different things intersect is a brief novella rather than one of the main novels. I was not expecting that. Um, and I loved it. It was very fun, and I feel like this was like a little hint of what is to come. Like, I feel like the excitement that I felt while reading this and seeing Kelsier interact with with Hoyd and with Chris, and have all these characters acknowledge each other and talk to each other about each other. And then, of course, the Ire. We'll get to the Ire and where they're from in a moment. Don't you worry. I have some thoughts on that. Um, but yeah, like that whole crossover element, like the Avengers Endgame effect, kind of. I feel like that's something that we are going to see more and more of as we get deeper into the Cosmere going forward. Um, Considering the end of Words of Radiance, I'm guessing that I'll see more of this even going into the remaining two Stormlight books. But I expect it to fully take off maybe once we're done with Era 2 and Stormlight Era 1, which should be pretty soon, because like the next Mistborn book is the end of Era 2, and the next Stormlight book is the end of Stormlight Era 1. So I feel like once those two series wrap up, whatever comes next, which is probably Mistborn Era 3, is going to be like a full-on Cosmere story rather than like a specific world story. I could be wrong though. Maybe Brandon has very different plans than that. So the Ire. Actually, no. Before I talk about the Ire, I want to talk about a minor thing here. So I mentioned in my video on Shadows of Self, I believe I talked about this idea that the original Mistborn trilogy, Era 1, did not really develop Preservation and Ruin as characters. Like, they were very one-dimensional. This is the good god, this is the bad god. He's bad because he's evil. Like that was very much the level of depth that those two characters got in the original trilogy. And I talked about how some of Sazed's comments in Shadows of Self sort of gave some nuance to Ruin's point of view. Like, sure, Ruin himself, or Ati, as his name apparently was, like, Ati, the person, was not the best person around. Like, he had some issues. He was pretty evil in how he interpreted his role. But the role itself serves a purpose. And we see this with Sazed. Like, Sazed talks about how Ruin is not just destruction, but also change, and how things have to change in order to grow and develop. And here, in Secret History, I feel like we get the flip side of that. So we got a moment of sort of positive outlook on Ruin in Shadows of Self, and here we get a somewhat negative outlook on Preservation's ideology. Because, of course, Preservation thinks Rashek was great. Like, we always knew that Rashek was serving Preservation, in a sense. Like, he was an enemy of Ruin, and so obviously he was serving Preservation. But I always kind of assumed that Preservation was, like, kind of, like, not thrilled about Rashek as a person. But apparently not. Apparently Preservation just loves Rashek, and the main reason he loves Rashek is because Rashek, A, is immortal, and therefore he himself is preserved forever, and B, he preserves the world in a fixed state. The final empire is a static thing. There is no growth, no invention, no technological development, nothing. The final empire is like an insect in amber for 1,000 years. And that is exactly what Preservation wants. So Ruin is correct when he says that, like, if Preservation won once and for all, if Ruin was, like, fully and permanently defeated and Preservation was still around, the final empire is a pretty good approximation of what that world would look like. It wouldn't be nice. It wouldn't be pleasant. So I enjoyed that a lot. And I also enjoyed the fact that Hoyd and Kelsier, changing topics here, like, I enjoyed the interactions between Hoyd and Kelsier, because they're very similar characters, kind of. Like, they're both these kind of, like, tricksters, but Hoyd is just a much better trickster than Kelsier. Like, Kelsier's a trickster, but he's a trickster who's, like, got his own damage, essentially. Whereas Hoyd is just pure, wit, wit, pun intended, and brilliance and like quick thinking and trickery. So I really enjoyed their interactions, and I found it hilarious that uh, throughout this entire story, Kelsier just keeps trying to punch incredibly powerful godlike entities. I just find that very funny. And the final thing I want to talk about Hoid, before I move on to the other important thing I want to talk about, which is the Elantrians, is that apparently Hoid's real name is Cephandrius, which is a terrible name. I understand why he changed it. That's all I have to say about that. Um. Anyway, uh, yeah. So, oh yeah. Also, Hoid is now Mistborn. Like Hoid got one of the Lerasium nuggets from the well, and I kind I'm gonna be honest, I'd kind of forgotten that Hoid has a thing where he's actually trying to get various forms of investiture. And the reason I'd forgotten that is because the only time it ever happened was literally the first time we saw Hoid, like back in Elantris. Back in Elantris, it's made explicit that that's why Hoid is there. He's trying to master Aeon Door and failing. And ever since then, he's just sort of been like, he's shown up in every book, but we never get to see him going about his actual main mission. So I honestly completely forgot that that's what he was after until the moment when he had the Lerasium nuggets, and I was like, oh, that's why Hoyd is doing everything that he's doing. How could I forget that that's what he's after? Anyway, so he did actually manage to get one. I'm assuming he ate it, and I'm assuming it worked. So I'm assuming Hoyd is Mistborn now. Whether his Mistborn powers work outside of Scadrial, I don't know. Or whether they work at all because he's not biologically from Scadrial, and people of Scadrial are, like, biologically weird. Anyway, that's enough about Hoyd. The Ire. So, okay, spoilers for Elantris in 3, 2, 1. The Ire are Elantrians. I don't know if they're Elantrians before the events of Elantris or after the events of Elantris, but they're definitely Elantrians. So they have silver skin. That's the first clue, which I didn't pick up on because I was like, why would I'm sure there's lots of different things that have silver skin, and also they didn't have godlike powers. But now I realize that the reason they don't have godlike powers is because they're not in Erelon, and Aeon Door is location based. So they probably don't have their Elantrian powers unless they're in Erelon, I'm guessing. Anyway, so they have silver skin, that's the first clue. The second clue is a more subtle one, which is that one of them at one point prays to devotion. And devotion is one of the two shards that used to inhabit Cell. And both the devotion and the other shard Dominion are dead now. But I would guess that the only people who would reasonably pray to devotion are people from Cell. So that still doesn't necessarily mean they're Elantrians, but it does indicate that they are from Cell, and the silver skin then completes the picture. But the third hint is my favorite. So each chapter, or rather each part of this story, because like there's chapters, but they're like nameless, like they're just numbers. But there's also parts, and each of the parts has a title. So each part of this story has one of those Mistborn chapter icons, which are essentially the symbols for the metals that exist in Scadrial, which also double as numbers and maybe letters. I'm not entirely sure how that whole symbol system works. But those symbols all have a really distinct style. They are all made out of semicircles, or rather crescents. They are made out of these wedges that I think represent hemalurgic spikes. Maybe the semicircles represent, like, through chemical bands. Possibly. Anyway, so they're made out of spikes, they're made out of semicircles, and they're made out of little dots, which maybe represent elemancy somehow, or something. Coins, maybe, or nuggets of Laracium, whatever. So every single chapter of every single Mistborn book begins with one of these symbols, and they're all have a really, really recognizable style. They're all made of just these three elements: wedges, crescents, and dots. And the chapter where the ire shows up, or rather the part where the ire shows up, which is literally called ire, also has one of these symbols as its as its heading. But the symbol is weird. So the symbol is made up of the key stylistic elements of one of the Scadrial metal symbols. So it has the wedge, it has two crescents, it has four dots. However, unlike literally every other symbol on every other chapter in every Mistborn book so far, this one does not essentially make the shape of a circle. Like, all of the others are fundamentally just different circles with the wedges sticking into the circle. This one looks completely different. And I noticed this while I was reading. I was like, huh, what's this weird symbol? But I didn't think to make the connection because I hadn't encountered the ire yet and hadn't realized that they're Elantrians. Once I realized that they're Elantrians, I went back to that particular symbol and I immediately recognized it for what it is, which is an Aeon. It's an Aeon drawn in the style of one of the Mistborn symbols. And that, in my opinion, is one of the coolest little details that any of these books has had so far. I absolutely love that little detail. It's such a nice little misdirection where it's blatantly an Aeon, like you can literally see the shape of Erewhon in it, but it's an Aeon that's just been drawn to look like something from a different series. Mwah! Perfect. So I'm guessing that that Aeon is probably the Aeon Ire, which the Ire would be named after. I'm guessing Ire is an Aeon because they all tend to be three-letter words. Yeah, so I don't know why the Ire are here. I'm now really, really curious to read the sequel to Elantris, because I'm guessing that's where we'll probably find out what the Ire's deal is. But so I don't know why they're here, and I don't really have much to say about them here because we really only see them briefly from Kelsier's perspective, and he doesn't know they're Elantrians, so he doesn't have any interesting perspective on it. The important thing is that they're a seed for the future, and a lot of this particular novella works like that. It's essentially sowing seeds for future stories, which is risky, but I trust it because Sanderson has so far delivered. So yeah, that's enough of me gushing and nerding out about the Ire and their Elantrian connection. What else do I have to say about this story? Right, there's two more things I want to talk about. I want to talk about the ending of the story, or rather, the lack of ending, because this story doesn't really end, it just sort of stops, and it's clear that there's more to it. We don't actually learn how Kelsier came to be alive again. We don't learn why he seems to have a hemorrhagic spike through one of his eyes by the time Era 2 rolls around. We don't learn how he ended up going south to see Alex people. How he created the Bands of Mourning, how he apparently gained feruchemical powers, how he invented those devices. None of this is made clear to us here at all. Because at the end of this story, Kelsier is very much still a cognitive shadow and not a living, breathing human man. However, it's also clear that a part of the answer is that Spook helped him. And this actually answers something that I was wondering in Era 2. See, this is a good way to recontextualize something from the main series without cheapening it, because this completely recontextualizes the reveal from Shadows of Self that Spook was obsessed with hemalurgy. Like, this was a reveal that was super notable in Shadows of Self because it seems so out of character, because Why would Spook do that? Spook was a victim of hemalurgy. He, of all people, should know how horrible it is. Right? Well, apparently no, because apparently now we know the reason. He was doing it not out of some perverse interest in hemalurgy or desire to preserve the art at all costs. He was doing it because he was trying to figure out a way to bring Kelsier back. So I like that reveal. I do hope one day we get to actually see learn the details of how that happened, and it's not left vague, because I'm really curious. Because Kelsier seems to be not just back, but back in his original body. Because when Wax has a vision of him, or rather, when he sees one of Kelsier's memories, Kelsier's arms have the scars from the pits of Hath Sin. So that's his original body. It's not like his soul is now in it. Like, my first thought was like, oh, his soul is somehow infused in that spike that was stabbed in someone's eye, and like he just is possessing a new body. But no, that's his original body. So I'm curious to see what the hell is happening there. What else? Right, the other interesting thing here is Chris's introduction to this whole section of the book. So Chris, when Chris just writes about Scadrial in general, she says, Scadrial is one of only 2 places in the Cosmere where humankind does not predate the arrival of shards. Now, I knew that humans on Scadrial were created from scratch by ruin and preservation. That was actually revealed in the original trilogy. So that's not news. What is news is that that's apparently not universally true for every other planet. I had just kind of assumed that humans all originate from one specific planet, and then the shards just recreated them on a bunch of different planets. But apparently humans are like crabs, and life across the Cosmere just keeps spontaneously evolving humans on different planets? I don't know. I guess? Maybe? So that's a weird reveal. Again, the other thing that's notable here is that there's apparently one other world where shards created humans. And I have 2 theories about this. I think it's either Roshar or Nulthus. It's definitely not Cell. And the reason I think it's Roshar or Nulthus is because those are the 2 worlds where humans seem to have like fundamentally different biological rules to like us. Like, humans on Cell are just humans unless they're invested. Humans on Nulthus have like removable souls that they can just like breathe out of their bodies if they want, which is weird, but that could also be explained through investiture. The reason Roshar is my main candidate is because humans on Roshar tend to be like super weird. Like, everything follows different rules. The genetics of eye and hair color work completely differently to the real world. Some human races have rather stone nails. Some have blue skin. Some have long eyebrows. Like, humans on Roshar are fundamentally not, like, they're not Homo sapiens. They are biologically a different species to us. And the same is true of humans on Scadrial. Now, humans on Scadrial are different from us, not because ruin and preservation made them that way, but because Rashek made them that way. But they are still different. Like, that's an undeniable fact. So my guess for right now is that Roshar is maybe the other one where humans weren't originally from there. But like I said, my second guess would be Nulthus. What else? Is there anything else here that's interesting? Not really. Yeah, I think that's everything I have to say about this one, which was a lot. I talked a lot for like a little novella, but this was a very big and important novella. Like this was a turning point for the Cosmere as a whole. I think. I think we'll look back on this in the future once the Cosmere is more complete. We'll look back on this as like the moment shit got real, as it were. Um, so yeah, um, I'm going to go and read Edge Dancer now, which I'm extremely excited about because I love Lift. Um, yeah. Uh, See you when I do that. I don't know if I'll do 2 videos for Edge Dancer or 1. I guess I'll see when I get halfway through Edge Dancer if I have enough thoughts about the first half of Edge Dancer to justify a whole video. We'll see. Um, anyway, goodbye and see you next week with our dear friend Lift. Bye.